It's a little after 4 in the morning, and Colonel Max Wachtel is standing over a table covered in maps of southern England, holding two pieces of paper that cannot both be true. One is built from radio data, tiny transmitters riding inside a handful of his flying bombs, reporting back on where the weapon actually lands. It says the bombs are falling short, landing in open country, never reaching the target. The other comes from something Wachtel trusts more: agents, men on the ground in England, watching the impacts, sending the truth home by wireless. And they're telling him the opposite. The bombs are flying long, overshooting, coming down past where they should. A weapon cannot fall short and fly long at the same time. Wachtel has to choose which report to believe. He chooses the men over the machine. He will spend the rest of his life not fully understanding why that was the wrong call. The weapon was the V1. Germany called it Vergeltungswaffe, Vengeance Weapon 1, a name built to promise the German public payback for the ruins of Hamburg and Cologne. Over the course of the campaign, more than 10,000 of them would be fired at Britain. A pilotless aircraft, cheap to build, requiring no pilot to risk and no crew to train, aimed at a single city and left to fall wherever its machinery decided. Here's the part that took decades to fully come out. The agents Wachtel trusted, the ones feeding reports back across the channel about where his bombs were landing, belonged to British intelligence. Not some of them. Nearly all of them. And this wasn't a wartime improvisation, patched together after the bombing started. Britain had spent years turning, capturing, or simply inventing the German spy network inside its own borders, long before the first V1 ever left a ramp in France. By June of 1944, Germany's intelligence picture of Britain wasn't compromised. It was authored. To understand how a modern military machine walked into a trap that deep, you have to go back further, to the drawing board where this weapon was born, and to the woman in England who saw it coming a year before it ever flew. By 1942, Germany had a problem that no amount of courage could fix. Manned bombers were dying over Britain in numbers the Luftwaffe couldn't sustain. Trained crews, expensive airframes, months of preparation, gone in a single sortie. The V1 was the answer on paper. No pilot to lose, no crew to train. A fraction of the cost of a bomber, built to be thrown away on every single mission. Germany wasn't trying to build a precise weapon. It was trying to build a disposable one, cheap enough to fire by the thousand. The trouble is, Britain wasn't waiting around to find out what that meant. In November of 1943, a Women's Auxiliary Air Force officer named Constance Babington Smith was studying an aerial photograph of a German research station on the Baltic coast, a place called Piemont. She was looking for pilotless aircraft. She'd been told to keep an eye out for exactly that, weeks earlier. And there, on a ramp barely a millimeter long on the print in front of her, was a shape she didn't recognize. Small, cruciform, sitting on an incline, pointed toward England. She'd found it. Months before it ever flew, a British photo interpreter had already seen Germany's Vengeance weapon, sitting on its launch rail, waiting. Britain didn't sit on that discovery. On the night of the 17th of August, nearly 600 RAF bombers flew to Piemont and tried to bomb the program out of existence before it could start. It cost them. 40 aircraft failed to return. Over 200 aircrew were lost in a single night. Over a target most of the men flying to it had never heard of before that evening's briefing. The raid didn't stop the V1. It delayed it, weeks, by most estimates, not months. But it proved something important. Britain knew this weapon was coming, and Britain was willing to pay in blood to slow it down. None of that was enough. On the 13th of June, 1944, 1 week after the Normandy landings, the first V1 crossed the Channel and came down on a railway bridge in Bethnal Green, in the East End of London. 6 people were killed. It was clumsy, almost accidental. Most of the bombs fired that first night never made it across the water at all. But 5 days later, the real campaign began, and it began with a number that should have been impossible to ignore and somehow still was. On the 18th of June, a Sunday morning, the Guards' Chapel at Wellington Barracks was packed for the Sun Eucharist, soldiers and civilians together. Worshippers who had no idea a machine with no pilot and no target had been drifting toward their roof for the last several minutes. It cut out overhead, then it dropped. The blast brought the concrete roof down onto the congregation below. 121 people were killed. 141 more were pulled from the wreckage injured, some of them not freed for nearly 2 full days. It remains the single deadliest V1 strike of the entire war, and it happened not to a factory, not to a military target, but to a church, mid-service, less than a week into the campaign. This is the part worth sitting with. Britain had spotted this weapon on film almost a year before it fired a shot. Britain had already sent hundreds of airmen to their deaths trying to strangle the program in its cradle. And none of it, not the photograph, not the raid, not the warning, was enough to stop a Sunday morning service from becoming a mass grave. Guns and bombers were doing everything guns and bombers could do. It clearly wasn't going to be enough on its own, because the real fight against this weapon wasn't only happening in the sky over Kent. It was happening in quiet rooms in London, where a handful of very unlikely people were already, carefully, patiently, lying to Berlin. If you're picturing trained operatives, cool, disciplined, plucked from some elite corner of British intelligence, and dropped into place, you're picturing the wrong people entirely. Start with the one the Germans trusted most. Juan Pujol Garcia was a Spaniard who had, by his own account, failed at nearly everything he'd tried. Failed student, miserable soldier, and most relevantly, a failed chicken farmer, running a poultry operation outside Barcelona that never turned a profit. In 1941, he walked into the British embassy and offered to spy for them. They turned him down. He tried again. Turned down again. So he did something almost nobody else would have thought to do. He went to the Germans instead, with a plan already forming in his head to work against them from the inside. The WWII took the bait. They gave him a code book, a cover name, and orders to get to England and start recruiting. Pujol never left Lisbon. He didn't need to. Sitting in a rented room with tourist guidebooks, railway timetables, and a public library card, he built an entire spy network by hand, on paper. 24 agents, then more, none of them real. A Welsh nationalist supposedly furious at the English. A Swiss businessman. A dock worker in Glasgow who didn't exist because the man he was based on didn't exist either. Pujol invented all of it from a desk 400 miles from the country he claimed to be watching, and mailed his fiction to Germany as fact. It worked almost too well. The WWII was so pleased with their new asset that British codebreakers, who'd been quietly reading German traffic the whole time, spotted the flood of reports before Pujol had even made contact with London. MI5 didn't recruit him so much as catch up to him. They gave him a case officer, a proper radio, and a new codename, Garbo, and let him keep doing exactly what he'd already been doing, only now on their payroll as well as Germany's. Germany would go on to pay him the modern equivalent of something in the neighborhood of £1 million over the course of the war, and award him the Iron Cross, second class, for services rendered to the Reich. Britain, working from the other side of the same lie, would later give him an MB for the same work. Then there's Eddie Chapman, who came at the whole business from the opposite direction entirely. Chapman wasn't a failed farmer. He was a working criminal, a professional safecracker, sitting in a jail cell on the German-occupied Channel Islands when the WWII came looking for men willing to be dropped behind enemy lines. They trained him, taught him codes, sabotage, wireless procedure, parachuted him into the English countryside with orders to blend in and get to work. He turned himself in almost the moment he landed. The Germans never found out. As far as Berlin was concerned, their agent, codenamed Zigzag, for a past that zigzagged between crime and chaos, was operating deep inside England, sending back exactly the kind of material a trained saboteur should send. They trusted him enough to eventually pull him out, debrief him, and send him back in again. They gave him the Iron Cross too. A career criminal, decorated by the Third Reich, working the entire time for the people he was supposedly betraying. This was the shape of the whole operation. A committee in London, officially, dryly, the 20 Committee, so named because the Roman numerals for 20 spell out a double cross, oversaw a stable of these agents, real ones and invented ones, feeding a constant diet of half-truths and outright fiction back across the channel. And by the summer of 1944, with the flying bombs falling, the Germans handed this same network a new and very specific assignment. Tell us where the V1s are actually landing, so we can correct our aim. Which meant Britain now had to decide what to do with that trust. The honest answer coming back from these agents would have told German gunners the truth, that their bombs were falling short of central London, landing instead across the more crowded southern boroughs. The historical record describes a real and difficult argument that followed, inside the highest levels of British government, over whether to let that truth go out or to send something else instead. Reports suggesting the bombs were overshooting, in the hope that German crews would shorten their range and, in doing so, push the average point of impact further from the packed heart of the city. It was not a clean decision. It meant weighing which of Britain's own neighborhoods would carry more of the weight of a weapon nobody could actually control, and doing it deliberately, in a committee room, on paper. Whatever conclusion they reached, it was not reached lightly, and the debate itself tells you something the tidier version of this story tends to leave out, that even the people running the deception understood exactly how much was riding on it, and that there was no answer available to them that cost nothing. So that's who was lying, and roughly what they were lying about. A failed farmer with a library card, a safecracker with a code name, a committee arguing over a map of London, trying to decide how to spend a lie responsibly. But none of them had actually seen a V1 fly, not up close, not the way the men firing it, or the men trying to shoot it down, saw it. To understand why this deception could work at all, why a handful of fabricated reports could matter so much to a modern military machine, you have to look at the machine itself. At what a flying bomb with no pilot, no camera, and nothing resembling a target-seeking brain was actually doing every time it left the ramp. Here's what nobody in that machine had actually seen fly: a weapon that couldn't see anything at all. Strip away the propaganda name, the vengeance branding, the sirens, and the V1 was, mechanically, one of the strangest weapons ever put into mass production. It carried a warhead of roughly 850 kilograms of high explosive, mounted on an airframe barely 8 meters long, powered by an engine that had nothing in common with a conventional aircraft engine at all. A pulse jet. No turbine, no smooth continuous burn, just a grid of spring-loaded shutters at the front, snapping open and shut roughly 45 times a second, igniting a tiny explosion of fuel and air with every single pulse. That's the sound people heard. Not a plane, a stutter, a harsh, mechanical buzz that seemed to rattle the sky itself. Which is exactly why Londoners started calling it the buzz bomb before any one official had told them what it was. Launch was violent by design. A steam and chemical catapult flung the thing down a fixed ramp roughly 50 meters long, hurling it into the air at something close to 200 miles an hour, fast enough for the pulse jet to catch and sustain flight on its own. From that point on, the missile was flying at around 400 miles an hour, and it was completely, entirely alone. No pilot, no camera, no radio link back to anyone. Once it left that ramp, nothing on Earth was steering it. What kept it flying straight was almost insultingly simple. A gyroscope held it level. A magnetic compass held it on whatever heading had been set before launch. And on the nose, a small propeller spun in the airstream, driven by nothing more than the wind rushing past, mechanically counting revolutions the way an odometer counts miles. Before the crew launched the weapon, they wound a number into that counter. A number worked out from the distance to London and the wind that day. As the bomb flew, the propeller turned, and the counter ticked down. When it hit zero, it didn't release a bomb over a target it could see. It didn't release anything over anything. Explosive bolts fired, the controls slammed over, and the whole aircraft simply nosed into a dive and fell. Say that plainly, because it's the whole story in one sentence. This weapon never aimed at a target. It aimed at a number. A stopwatch strapped to an autopilot, set running before it ever left the ground, with no way to correct itself once it was in the air. And when it dropped, the fuel in the tank usually flung forward, away from the feed line, and the engine choked out. The buzzing stopped. For the few seconds it took to fall, London went quiet, and that silence, not the noise, was the sound people learned to actually fear. Now you can see exactly why Wachtel's decision back in that requisition house near Cryle mattered as much as it did. This weapon had no way to check its own homework. The only way anyone could ever know if the range setting on that propeller counter was correct, too short, too long, or dead on, was to be told, after the fact, by somebody watching where the bombs actually came down. There was no other feedback loop, no camera to review, no pilot to debrief, just a number, set on the ground, and a report that came back days later from London telling the crews whether that number had been right. Whoever controlled those reports controlled, in a very real sense, what number went into every counter that followed. Which is why it's worth knowing, before you judge the weapon too harshly, that even without a single fabricated report, the V1 was never going to be a precise instrument. Modern researchers who went back decades later and mapped every recorded impact against the geography of wartime London calculated the weapon's actual accuracy using something called circular error probable. The radius of a circle, centered on wherever the bombs were actually landing on average, inside which half of them fell. For the V1 firing at London, that circle worked out to somewhere around 12.5 kilometers. Half the weapons that reached the city landed somewhere inside a ring nearly the width of London itself. Hold on to that number. It matters more than it sounds like it should later. For now, though, London had a more immediate problem than statistics. It had bombs coming in day and night, on no fixed schedule a fighter pilot could plan around, and the opening weeks of the defense were, by most honest accounts, close to chaos. Fighters and anti-aircraft guns were operating in the same stretch of sky, chasing the same targets, occasionally shooting at each other by accident. Something had to change fast, and it did, under two men working in tandem. General Sir Frederick Pyle, running Anti-Aircraft Command, and Air Marshal Sir Roderick Hill, running the fighter defenses. Their fix was blunt and effective: pull the guns entirely out of the fighters' airspace. Move them down to a dedicated belt along the south coast, facing open sea, so that anything they hit fell on empty ground instead of rooftops. Give the fighters everything behind that belt and out over the channel. Stack barrage balloons on the hills south of London as one last net for whatever slipped through. Guns had their lane, fighters had theirs. Nobody was shooting at anybody on the same side anymore. Even with that fixed, the guns alone were nearly useless at first. In the campaign's opening week, the coastal gun belt was knocking down roughly 17 out of every 100 V1s that came within range. 17%. Against a weapon flying low, flying fast, and giving gunners only a few seconds of exposure, that was close to the theoretical ceiling for guns being aimed and fired the old-fashioned way. By trained men doing math under pressure, faster than the human body was built to do it. What changed the math wasn't better guns. It was three pieces of technology, mostly American, arriving together in the span of a few weeks and stacking on top of each other. First, a new radar that could lock onto a fast-moving target and track it automatically, smoothly, without a man cranking a hand wheel trying to keep pace with something faster than his own reflexes. Second, an electronic predictor, essentially an analog computer, that took that tracking data and calculated continuously where the V1 would actually be by the time a shell got there, then aimed the guns at that empty patch of sky in advance. And third, the deadliest piece of the three, the proximity fuse, a shell that carried its own tiny radio transmitter in the nose, constantly broadcasting and listening for its own echo. As it closed on the target, the reflected signal grew stronger, and when it was close enough, the fuse fired the shell on its own. The gunner no longer needed a direct hit. He needed to get a shell into the same rough patch of sky as a bomb, and the shell would finish the job itself. Married together, those three systems turned that gun belt from a nuisance into a wall. The kill rate climbed from 17% to roughly 60% within a matter of weeks, then into the 70s, and on one extraordinary day near the end of August, it hit 82 out of every 100. Early in the campaign, it had taken something on the order of 2,000 shells to bring down a single V1. By the campaign's end, it was taking roughly 100. In the air, one aircraft above all earned its reputation against this particular enemy. The Hawker Tempest, the fastest low-altitude fighter Britain had, and the only one that could reliably run a V1 down in level flight and still have margin to close the gap. Tempest squadrons accounted for more V1 kills than any other aircraft type in the war, and when the guns ran dry, or the angle wasn't there for a clean shot, a small number of pilots discovered something that still sounds almost too reckless to be true. Use a wingtip and gently under the flying bomb's own short wing, tip it just enough to disturb the airflow, and topple its gyroscopes before it ever reached the city. No bullets fired, just nerve, and a few feet of clearance, at 400 miles an hour. By late summer, the arithmetic had flipped entirely in Britain's favor. A weapon that had once come through almost unopposed was now being cut down 4 times out of 5 before it ever reached London. And it still wasn't enough to stop the bombs from coming, because for every V1 the guns and the fighters tore out of the sky over the English coast, there was another one already moving down an assembly line hundreds of miles away. Built not in some gleaming factory floor, but underground, in tunnels, by people the war had already stripped of everything but their ability to work until they couldn't anymore. No radar could reach them. No proximity fuse could save them. The real cost of this weapon wasn't only being paid in the skies over Kent. It was being paid in the dark, long before any bomb ever reached a launch ramp at all. That factory had a name. The Mittelwerk, dug into a mountain in central Germany, where production of the V1 and its larger cousin, the V2, was moved once Allied bombing made surface factories too dangerous to trust. It was worked entirely by prisoners from a nearby concentration camp. Men marched underground, fed almost nothing, and worked in tunnels with no daylight and barely enough air, assembling the same weapons that were, at that exact moment, falling on London and Antwerp. Historians estimate that roughly 20,000 of these forced laborers died building Germany's vengeance weapons. 20,000. That's more people than the V2 rocket managed to kill in the whole of Britain. Some died of exhaustion, some of disease, or starvation, or simply being worked past what a human body can survive, and roughly 200 were hanged outright, executed in front of the others, specifically for sabotage, for loosening a bolt, for a bad weld left just bad enough, for choosing, quietly, to build the weapon wrong. London wasn't the only city that kept paying, either. Once the launch sites in France were overrun that September, and Britain's own government stood up and told the country the Battle of London had been won, the bombs didn't stop. They simply moved. Germany turned what was left of the V1 campaign, along with the V2 that followed it, toward the port of Antwerp, a city the Allies needed desperately to keep their armies supplied. Thousands of flying bombs and rockets fell on Antwerp and the towns around it over the following months. On a single evening in December, a V2 came down directly on a packed cinema in the middle of a film screening, killing more than 500 people in one strike, soldiers and civilians together, in seats, watching a movie. Antwerp would come to be called, by the people who lived through it, the City of Sudden Death. It's a title that's earned far less attention than what happened in London, and it deserves more than a footnote. So, after all of that, the fake spies, the wingtipping pilots, the proximity fuses, the tunnels, did the deception actually work? Did those forged reports, written in a London office and mailed to Berlin in a dead man's handwriting, really bend the fall of those bombs away from the crowded heart of the city, the way the story has always been told? Here's where the honest version of this gets harder than the tidy one. For decades, the story ended the way you'd expect. The men who ran the deception said, afterward, in memoirs and interviews, that it worked, that the false reports pushed German range settings short, that the average impact point drifted away from central London and toward the less crowded southern boroughs, and that thousands of lives were saved as a result. It's a good ending. It's the ending most retellings of this story reach for, because it's the one that makes the cleverness pay off on screen. But go back to the actual evidence, and the picture gets murkier. In 2018, 2 researchers went into Britain's National Archives and pulled the raw wartime records, the actual plotted location of every V1 impact across London, cross-referenced against population density, block by block. They rebuilt the whole campaign using modern statistical mapping, and what they found complicates the legend. The V1, on its own, without any deception at all, had a natural spread so wide, that 12.5-kilometer margin of error we talked about earlier, that the shift in impact point the deception is credited with may simply be lost inside the weapon's own inherent inaccuracy. Impossible to isolate, impossible to prove. And there's something else, something that lands harder. The German officers who actually ran the launch batteries said, after the war, in their own words, that they never changed their aiming point at all. Not once. If that's true, then the range counters weren't being adjusted based on Wachtel's decision, or on anyone's decision. The bombs may have been landing exactly where the guidance system's own built-in error always meant they would, which doesn't mean the deception was pointless, or that it didn't happen, or that the people who ran it were lying about their intentions. The 20 Committee was real. Garbow's fabricated network was real. The cabinet argument over which of London's own neighborhoods might absorb more of the weight was real, and it was agonized over by people who knew exactly what they were choosing. All of that happened. What the evidence can no longer support, with any real confidence, is the neat part of the story, the part where the lie demonstrably worked, and the number of lives it saved can be counted. Maybe that's the real answer to the question this whole story opened with. Wachtel stood in a requisition house near Crile, holding 2 reports that couldn't both be true, and chose to trust the men over the machine. He was wrong to trust them. The men were lying, and they'd been lying to him from the start. But whether that particular lie changed a single bomb's flight path, whether it moved the weapon even a few hundred meters off the course its own crude guidance had already set it on, is something the archive can no longer tell you with certainty. Picture it like this. A researcher, decades later, sitting at a desk with a stack of faded impact reports pulled from a government archive, plotting each one by hand onto a digital map of wartime London. Dot after dot after dot, clustering not around Trafalgar Square, Not around Tower Bridge where the Germans were said to be aiming, but a few miles south, in a quiet residential borough called Dulwich. Was that the lie working exactly as intended? Or was that simply where a blind, spinning propeller and a stopwatch built by a defeated empire were always going to send it, deception or no deception at all? Nobody alive can tell you for certain, not anymore. The machine never knew where it was going, and in the end neither quite do we.